Someone you love is going to die one day. So are you. You know this. You've known it since you were a child, probably before anyone explained it to you in words. And yet, somewhere underneath that knowledge, there's a strange resistance, a part of your mind that simply refuses to believe it applies to you personally. You probably think that resistance is just denial.
Is it just denial? Or is there something more?
But the real answer is far stranger. That resistance isn't a flaw in your thinking. It might be one of the oldest pieces of software your brain runs. And to understand where it came from, you have to go back to a question that has haunted every human group that ever existed. What actually happens when a person stops moving, stops breathing, stops being there? Long before anyone wrote a word about heaven, hell, reincarnation, or any organized religion, humans were already doing something remarkable with their dead. They were burying them. Not just discarding the body the way you might expect from creatures with no concept of an afterlife, burying them with care. The archaeologist Paul Pettit has spent much of his career studying exactly this, the earliest deliberate burials in the Paleolithic record. His research points to humans, and even some of our close evolutionary relatives, intentionally placing bodies in graves, sometimes curled into specific positions, sometimes accompanied by tools, ornaments, or red pigment. Why would you do that for someone who, biologically, no longer needs anything? Think about what that actually required. Digging a grave with simple tools is hard physical labor. It takes time a group could have spent hunting, gathering, or resting. It exposes the living to risk, lingering in one place near a body instead of moving on. None of that is necessary if death is understood as pure biological shutdown, nothing more. Every minute spent on a burial is a minute spent on something that offers no practical survival benefit to the living, unless the act itself was doing some other kind of work. Here's the question worth sitting with. If a body is just a body once the person inside it is gone, why bother? Why dig a hole? Why curl the limbs just so? Why leave behind a stone tool that the person can clearly never use again? The presence of grave goods is the detail that should stop you. A spear, a necklace, a smear of ochre across the chest. These aren't random. They suggest a belief, even a faint one, that something about the person continued past the moment their heart stopped. Not necessarily a fully formed concept of heaven. Maybe something closer to a journey, a transition, a version of the person that still needed equipment for wherever they were going next. This wasn't a one-time event in one isolated group. Burial practices like this appear independently across vastly separated populations with no contact with each other. That's the detail anthropologists keep circling back to. When completely unconnected groups of humans, separated by oceans and thousands of years, all arrive at the same basic instinct, that something survives death, it starts to look less like culture and more like cognition, less like a story people told each other, and more like something the human brain does on its own. Picture it. A group in one part of the world who will never meet a group on another continent, who share no language, no trade routes, no shared mythology. Both independently decide to curl a body into the same fetal-like position before covering it with earth. Both decide a necklace or a tool belongs beside the body. You don't get that kind of convergence from coincidence alone. You get it from something built into the architecture of a human mind, something that surfaces the same way wherever a human brain happens to exist. Why would a brain do that? Wouldn't it be more accurate, more useful even, to simply accept that death is the end, full stop? This is where the psychologist Jesse Baring's research becomes genuinely unsettling in the best way. Baring studied how people, including young children with no religious instruction at all, intuitively reason about the minds of the dead. His work suggested something counterintuitive. It's actually difficult for the human brain to fully simulate its own non-existence. When you try to imagine being dead, your brain tends to smuggle in a version of you that's still watching, still aware, still somehow present to witness the absence. You can't picture true nothingness from the inside, because the very act of picturing requires a you to do the picturing. In Bering's studies, even children who had been told explicitly that a deceased character's brain had completely stopped working would still insist that character could feel hungry or sad or could still want something. That's a strange contradiction to hold in a young mind that hasn't been shaped by any particular religion yet. It hints that this isn't something culture teaches children. It's something children, and the rest of us, arrive at largely on our own, simply by trying and failing to imagine pure absence. Sit with that for a second. Even your imagination, the most flexible tool you have, cannot fully render your own absence. It keeps inserting an observer, a witness, a faint flicker of selfhood that refuses to switch off, even inside a thought experiment about its own ending. Ancient humans didn't have access to this kind of psychological research, obviously. But they were running the exact same mental hardware. If your own mind keeps inserting a ghost of you into the idea of your death, of course an early human would conclude that some part of a person lingers. They weren't being naive. They were reporting, as accurately as anyone can, what their own consciousness was telling them. But there's a second piece to this puzzle, and it's less about imagination and more about fear. In the decades following the work of anthropologist Ernest Becker, a group of psychologists, Sheldon Solomon, Jeff Greenberg, and Tom Pyszczynski, built an entire experimental framework around a simple, brutal idea. Human beings are the only animals fully aware that they will die, and that awareness creates a background hum of dread that has to go somewhere. Their research, known as terror management theory, found that when people are quietly reminded of their own mortality, even briefly, they cling more tightly to their cultural beliefs, their group identities, their sense that their life has meaning beyond the purely biological. Belief in an afterlife, in some continuation, in something that outlasts the body, isn't just comforting. According to this body of research, it functions almost like an anxiety regulator, a way of making an unbearable fact bearable enough to keep living, working, and raising children inside of. In one of their best-known experiments, the researchers had participants simply write a short paragraph about their own death before judging unrelated tasks. Something as small as that brief writing exercise was enough to measurably shift how harshly people judged people who violated their cultural norms, and how strongly they defended their own worldview against challenge. A reminder of death, lasting only a few minutes, was enough to change behavior. Multiply that by an entire short, dangerous, disease-filled life, and you start to see why a continuous coping mechanism might have become necessary rather than optional. Now picture an early human group facing death constantly. Not occasionally, the way you might. Constantly. Children dying young. Hunts going wrong. Disease with no explanation and no cure. If death is everywhere, and your mind cannot picture its own ending without inserting a watcher, and that unmanaged dread threatens to paralyze the very behaviors that keep a group alive, hunting, caring for children, taking necessary risks, then a shared belief that something continues isn't a weakness. It's closer to a psychological pressure valve. It may have done real evolutionary work, allowing groups to function despite carrying the heaviest knowledge any species has ever had to carry. That reframes the whole picture. Ancient humans treating their dead with this much care wasn't superstition layered on top of ignorance. It might have been one of the most psychologically necessary inventions in human history. Here's where it gets even stranger. This isn't ancient history sealed away behind glass in a museum. You are still running this exact system, right now, today. You don't bury your dead with stone tools and red ochre, but you still flinch away from thinking too long about your own non-existence. You still find it almost physically difficult to imagine a world that simply continues without you in it. Try it right now. Picture the world 50 years after you're gone. People are still walking around, still having arguments, still drinking coffee in the morning. Notice how your mind keeps trying to insert a faint version of you, watching from somewhere, rather than truly imagining a world with no observer in it at all. That's Jesse Bering's research, alive and well in your own head, this very second. Even people who consciously believe death is a total, final end report this same glitch when researchers ask them to picture it. They know what they believe. Their imagination simply won't fully cooperate with it. That gap between what you believe on paper and what your mind actually does when you try to picture non-existence is one of the strangest, most consistent findings in this entire field of research. And notice something else. Whenever death becomes especially present in your life, a funeral, a diagnosis, a near miss, you probably find yourself clinging harder to the things that make your life feel like it matters. Your relationships, your work, your values, your legacy, even if you've never used that exact word for it. That's terror management theory, running quietly in the background, the same mental mechanism that may have first appeared around a Paleolithic grave, still doing its job inside a species that built skyscrapers and still can't fully picture its own ending. So the next time you catch yourself avoiding the thought of your own death, or clinging a little tighter to whatever gives your life meaning after a brush with mortality, you're not malfunctioning. You're not being irrational. You're running a survival mechanism that may be tens of thousands of years old, inherited from people who buried their dead with tools they would never use again, because some part of the human mind has never been fully able to accept that anyone, including itself, simply stops. That's the real answer, the one resting quietly underneath a question you've avoided your whole life. You think your resistance to thinking about death is just denial, but the real answer is that it never stopped being a survival mechanism.